Welcome to this Premier Training revision video, which is the second in the series that takes a look at the written tasks. And in this video, we'll look at some weaker answers to the question we looked at earlier in part 1. First, let's remind ourselves of the question. And if you'd prefer to look at a hard copy of this, please pause this video now and print one off. So, here's one possible answer to our question. And again, you might want to pause the video now to read it through. But remember, we're looking at a weaker answer here that isn't likely to gain very many marks. The first paragraph tells us there's suspicion of money laundering. This will probably gain a mark, but it doesn't say why or even what money laundering is. Presumably, the writer hopes that this will cover the legal issue mentioned in the question, but it doesn't mention any legislation or criminal offence. Another mark may be gained from saying she should report it to the MLRO. But what does MLRO stand for? And what happens if there isn't a money laundering reporting officer? The next paragraph starts with a fairly bland statement. It's basically restating the scenario, and it doesn't add anything to what the average person in the street would be able to say. Of course, it could well be an introduction to something far more interesting. Let's see. Well, we're not sure if this has anything to do with the last sentence or not. There'll probably be a mark for stating he's not being objective. And this covers the parts of the question that asks for which fundamental principles are under threat. But there's no explanation given. In the scenario, what makes it appear he's not being objective? And what does being objective mean anyway? The next sentence is probably the best sentence in this particular answer. It states a threat, which was required in the question, and it explains why there's a threat. However, it doesn't state what the threat is to. Do we assume it's a threat to the manager's objectivity? You won't get any marks if the examiner is left to assume anything from your answer. This final sentence looks to address safeguards. So there'll be another mark for this suggestion, but a safeguard should be a company policy. How would Heather know to go straight to the MLRO? So, overall, this answer might get 6 or 7 marks, but there might be 25 marks available. The answer has given minimal information, and explanations have been few and far between, and the examiner wouldn't be particularly impressed with an answer like this. Now let's look at another potential answer. This one's going to be slightly better than the last one, but still weak in several areas. And you might want to pause this video here to read the answer through first. The first paragraph shows there may be money laundering and gives an explanation as to why. But again, there's no explanation of what money laundering is. Note the incorrect spelling of stationery. Spelling and grammar may be taken into account at the advanced level if it affects meaning or makes your answer difficult to understand, but it's expected to be correct at the professional level. And this is a careless spelling mistake as the word is spelt correctly in the actual question. This second paragraph answers the question on what Heather should do, but it didn't offer the option of going to the MLRO if there was one. In addition, there was no mention of a suspicious activity report. In the third paragraph, the statement is correct, but there's no explanation given. A fundamental principle has been included and a threat, but the question suggested that there should be more than one of each. Now let's consider the final paragraph. This suggestion is unlikely to help at all. No accountant would take on a client if they suspected them of money laundering, as this should have been covered in their initial customer due diligence. And it's unlikely any marks would be gained for this answer. So, overall, this answer is still weak. Each part of the question has been addressed, but again very little explanation has been given. No alternative answers are provided, and only the very minimum has been covered for each point. There's obviously a conflict of loyalty in this scenario, but so far neither of the answers have addressed this. Now let's take a look at the final answer in this video, and this is probably the weakest answer of all. Once again, you might want to pause the video now so you can read it through. Let's take a look at the first paragraph. There's a lot of information here, and all of it correct. The problem is that none of it relates to the scenario. The examiner isn't looking to see how good your memory is, or your ability to learn sections of a book by heart. Instead, they're looking to see how you apply your knowledge. Next paragraph. Again, there's a lot of information here, but much of it is irrelevant. The question didn't ask the candidate to state all the fundamental principles, so no marks will be gained by stating them. The candidates might be eager to show that they know them all, but if it's irrelevant, then it'll be ignored. There's been some attempt to relate the answer to the scenario, but again there's very little explanation. Why is the manager not being objective? What does objective mean? And the final point is incorrect. There's no problem with discussing issues with your manager. Your manager will be an accountant too, so will be covered by the same ethical rules. In the third paragraph, the familiarity threat is a valid answer. But there was no need to list all the threats, as most of them were irrelevant to the scenario. And again, there's no explanation being given. In the next paragraph, the first few sentences get good marks, but it should only be the forerunner of an explanation relating to the scenario. Instead, we get a description which we could have got straight from a book. So a good beginning has finished up with very few marks at all. And finally, the last paragraph. This first sentence has nothing to do with the scenario at all. It's a quote directly from a book. But remember, there are no answers in the book. Additionally, what Heather should have done hasn't been addressed. Overall, there's nothing incorrect in this answer apart from the fact that it doesn't relate to the question for most of the time. You can state the rules, but only as long as it's followed up with something that actually relates to the scenario. There were plenty of explanations here, but almost all of them were irrelevant. So we've now explained how not to answer the written questions, and in our third and final video in this series, we'll show you what you should write in the written questions. I hope you found this video helpful, and thanks for watching.